I bought a storage unit at an online auction for $75. When the movers helped me clear it out, we found a locked metal box behind a false wall. Inside was $600,000 in cash and a handwritten list of names. One of them was mine. Good evening, dear listeners. I'm Clara, and I'm glad you found your way here. If this is your first time, please subscribe and drop a comment telling me what city you're listening from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. People ask me sometimes how I ended up at that auction in the first place. The honest answer is that I was trying to keep the lights on. My name is Joelle Merritt. I'm 41 years old, and 2 years ago, I was working double shifts at a copy center in Tucson, Arizona, eating microwave soup for dinner and avoiding my landlord's texts about the rent I was 4 weeks behind on. I had spent 7 years building a small bookkeeping firm with my business partner, a man named Dennis Farrow. Dennis was charming in the way that certain people are charming, confidently, reflexively, in a way you don't question until you have very specific reasons to. We had 12 small business clients, a decent reputation in the local Chamber of Commerce, and a lease on a 2-room office on Grant Road that we'd furnished mostly from estate sales. When Dennis came to me on a Tuesday morning in March and told me he was dissolving the partnership, I thought he meant we were closing down. I did not understand until 2 days later when I tried to log into our shared accounting software and found my credentials had been deactivated, that he meant he was taking the business and leaving me outside of it. He had spent the previous 6 weeks quietly transferring our client relationships to a new LLC he'd registered under his wife's name, moving our shared accounts, and getting everything in order before telling me. He left me with a desk I couldn't afford to store and a non-solicitation agreement his attorney had apparently drafted weeks before he said a word to me. I didn't have the money to fight it. My brother Owen kept calling and telling me to move back to Flagstaff. My mother kept forwarding job postings for office managers at dental practices. I kept saying I was fine. I was not fine. The storage unit auction was something I found through a Facebook group for resellers. Companies that specialize in defaulted storage units post listings online now, and if you're willing to bid on units with no inventory information, meaning you get one photo taken from the doorway, contents unknown, the opening bids can be extremely low. Most of those units contain nothing worth the hauling fee: a mattress, broken furniture, boxes of water-damaged paperwork, but occasionally someone gets lucky. The unit I bid on was at a facility called Desert West Storage in Casa Grande, 40 minutes south of Tucson, Unit 118. The photo showed stacked cardboard boxes, a tarp covering something large, and what looked like metal shelving along one wall. Nothing remarkable. The unit had been in default for 3 years. I won it for $75 because nobody else bid. I rented a pickup truck from a friend and drove out on a Saturday in early November. The facility manager, a quiet older man named Earl Briggs, walked me to the unit and cut the lock. He didn't stay. That wasn't unusual. The boxes were mostly what I expected: old clothes, kitchen supplies, a box of VHS tapes. The tarp covered a metal shelving unit bolted to the back wall, and behind the shelves, this is where it gets strange. I noticed that the drywall didn't sit flush. There was a seam I wouldn't have caught if I hadn't been trying to shift the shelving unit to get it through the door. A clean, straight seam running floor to ceiling, maybe 20 inches wide. I ran my hand along it. There was no handle, no obvious mechanism. But the wall gave slightly when I pushed. Not structurally, the way a wall gives when there's nothing behind it, but with resistance, like a door that had been carefully fitted into its frame. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. My first thought was not excitement, it was dread, because I had learned by that point in my life that things hidden deliberately are usually hidden for a reason. And reasons, in my experience, tend to be complicated. I went out to the truck, got a utility knife and a flathead screwdriver, and came back inside. I worked the seam for about 10 minutes. When the panel came free, the smell hit me first, dry and metallic, like the inside of a gun cabinet. Behind the panel was a space roughly 3 feet deep and 4 feet wide, just enough room for what was inside. A gray metal lockbox, the kind used for firearm storage, about 2 feet long, sitting on a low wooden shelf, and on top of it, a plain manila envelope with nothing written on the outside. I opened the envelope first. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in thirds. On it, handwritten in blue ink in careful, even letters, was a list of 11 names. I read through them. I didn't recognize most of them. Then I got to the 9th name on the list and stopped breathing for a moment. The 9th name was Joelle Merritt, my name. I stood in that storage unit for a long time after that, not moving, not thinking clearly, just staring at my own name on a list I had never seen before in a storage unit I had bought for $75 in a city I drove to on a whim on a Saturday morning. Then I folded the paper back up, put it in my pocket, and called my brother. I didn't open the lockbox that day. I want to be clear about that. I locked the storage unit back up, drove to a gas station on the highway, and sat in the truck cab with the engine running and the heat on, and my phone in my hand for about 20 minutes. Owen didn't answer. I didn't leave a voicemail because I didn't know what to say. What I knew at that point, I had legally purchased a storage unit and its contents. I had found a lockbox I couldn't open without the combination or a grinder. I had found a list of names that included mine. That last fact was the one I couldn't get my head around. How does your name end up in a stranger's storage unit? I drove back to Tucson and spent the rest of the day at my kitchen table with my laptop open, searching for every name on the list that I could read clearly from memory. 11 names. I remembered 9 of them. The first was a woman named Barbara Stull. I found a Barbara Stull in the Casa Grande area with a business listing for a tax preparation service. The second was a man named Howard Pinkett, who, based on LinkedIn, appeared to be a general contractor in the Phoenix metro area. The third was a business name, Cobry Valley Management, LLC, incorporated in Arizona in 2011. My own name on that list didn't make sense in any context I could construct. I had no connection to Casa Grande. I had never heard of Cobry Valley Management. I ran my name alongside every other name on the list in every search combination I could think of. Nothing. I did not sleep well that night. Monday morning, I went back to Desert West with a portable angle grinder I borrowed from the copy center's maintenance closet. My boss would not have approved, and I cut the lockbox open in the storage unit with the door pulled halfway shut. Inside was cash, a great deal of cash, bundled in rubber-banded stacks organized by denomination. I didn't count it there. I photographed everything with my phone, closed the unit, drove home, and laid the money out on my kitchen table. It took most of the afternoon. When I finished, the total was $612,000. $612,000. I sat back in my chair and looked at my ceiling for a while. Legally, the situation was not simple. Storage unit laws in Arizona give the buyer title to the contents of a purchased defaulted unit, but that doesn't resolve questions about the origin of those contents. If the money was the proceeds of a crime, the situation changed significantly. If it was legitimately saved and stored, it was probably mine. The list of names, and specifically my name on that list, made me very reluctant to assume anything. I also understood something else, sitting in my kitchen with $612,000 on my table. I had already removed the money from the storage facility. That was not ideal. Whatever I did next needed to account for that. I needed a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. I needed someone who understood found property, estate law, and who had no connection whatsoever to Casa Grande or Pinal County. I spent most of that evening searching. What I found was a woman named Roberta Chance, a solo practitioner in Scottsdale who described her practice on her website as focusing on asset recovery disputes, probate complications, and what she called legally ambiguous property situations. I called her the next morning from my car, parked outside a Walgreens, because I had started to feel, irrationally I told myself, that my apartment walls were listening. I told Roberta everything. The auction, the unit, the false wall, the lockbox, the cash, the list. I told her my name was on the list. I spoke for almost 15 minutes without stopping. When I finished, there was a pause. "Are you safe?" she asked. It was the same question I hadn't expected. "I think so," I said. "Don't move the money again. Don't tell anyone else. Come to my office tomorrow." Roberta Chance was a small woman in her mid-50s, with the kind of calm that comes from having seen genuinely complicated situations and not been destroyed by them. She listened to me again in her office, this time taking notes on a yellow legal pad. At the end, she set her pen down and looked at me with an expression I recognized, the expression of someone rapidly calculating what this situation would require. "The good news," she said, "is that you have a legitimately documented purchase. The auction is a matter of public record. What you found is legally yours unless and until someone can prove a prior valid claim. The bad news is that $612,000 in cash with no paper trail suggests this money has a history, and that history is going to determine how exposed you are." She recommended I do two things immediately. File a report with the Pinal County Sheriff's Office documenting the discovery, and make no further contact with anyone connected to the storage facility or any of the names on that list until we understood what we were dealing with. "Why does my name appear on that list?" I asked. "That," she said, "is what we need to find out." I filed the report that afternoon. The deputy who took my statement was professional and slightly wide-eyed. He made a phone call, then another. Within 90 minutes, I was sitting across from a detective, Marcus Caulfield, a lean man in his late 40s, who asked careful questions and wrote everything down in a small spiral notebook. He was interested in the list in particular. He photographed it, gloved, and put it in an evidence bag. He told me they would be in touch. Walking to my car afterward, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. The text said, "You made a mistake opening that box. Put it back and walk away." I screenshot it, forwarded it to Roberta, and called Detective Caulfield. The next morning, Roberta called me before I was out of bed. She'd had her paralegal pull public records on the storage unit. The unit had been rented in 2019 under the name of a man named Douglas Heth. Douglas Heth, according to county records, had died intestate in 2021. He had no listed next of kin. The unit had gone into default during the estate process, which apparently nobody had actively managed, and it had sat there for 3 years until I bid on it. "Douglas Heth," I repeated. "Ring any bells?" she asked. It didn't, but the name Cobry Valley Management did, because after I hung up, I searched Douglas Heth in connection with Cobry Valley Management and found a single result, a 2014 Arizona Corporation Commission, filing that listed Heth as a registered agent for the LLC alongside a man named Terry Bodine. Terry Bodine. I searched the name and sat back. Terry Bodine was a commercial property developer in the Phoenix metro area, currently operating a company called Bodine Capital Group. He had an Arizona Business Journal profile from 2019, describing him as one of the more active mid-market commercial real estate investors in the region. He had a professional headshot, a LinkedIn, and a pleasant, forgettable face. He also, I found after another hour of searching, had a 2016 civil suit against him from a subcontractor named Walter Kunze that had been settled confidentially. I brought all of this to Roberta the next day. She looked at it carefully and then leaned back in her chair. "Okay," she said. "Working theory only. And I want to be clear, it's a theory. Heth and Bodine ran a business together, possibly structured around Cobrae Valley Management, that generated cash they couldn't easily deposit. The storage unit was Heth's mechanism, off-site storage, in default risk condition, possibly because Heth was sick and not managing it, possibly because keeping it in low-profile default was deliberate. When Heth died, Bodine would have expected access to whatever they'd stored. But the estate went nowhere, nobody managed the unit properly, and it eventually went to auction. "And my name on the list?" I said. Roberta was quiet for a moment. "That's what concerns me most. It suggests Heth, or someone, had a reason to connect your name to this arrangement. Do you have any prior connection to Bodine or to Heth that you can think of? Any shared clients, any mutual contacts?" I went through it slowly. Dennis Farrow, my former partner, our client list, the years we'd worked together. And then something clicked slowly and then all at once the way those things do. 3 years before Dennis dissolved our partnership, we had done bookkeeping work for a property management company in South Tucson, a small company. We had worked with them for about 8 months before they terminated our services without explanation. The company's registered agent, listed on the documents we'd used to set up invoicing, was Douglas Heth. I told Roberta. She wrote it down carefully. "So Heth knew your name from a legitimate prior business relationship," she said. "That's actually useful. It gives us a context for the list that isn't necessarily criminal. It may be a record of people Heth had financial dealings with, legitimate and otherwise, and your name was on it because of the bookkeeping work, nothing more." "It may be." The phrase sat with me for a while. The quiet that followed lasted about a week. No more texts. No calls from unknown numbers. I stayed at my brother's place in Flagstaff for most of it, telling Owen only that there was a legal situation I was sorting out and that I needed somewhere to be that wasn't my apartment. He didn't push. Owen has always been good that way. During those days at Owen's, I did what I always do when I'm frightened and can't act yet. I organized. I went back through every document I could access from our work with the property management company. I had my own records from those months. Invoices, email threads, account summaries I'd kept as backup copies when we were still working together. Nothing in them looked obviously irregular, but I found something in an old email thread from that period. A CC on one message to an address I didn't recognize at the time. A Gmail account that, when I searched it now alongside the name Terry Bodine, came up in a forum post from a 2018 Arizona business dispute case as a contact address associated with Bodine Capital Group. Heth had been seeing Bodine on correspondence related to our bookkeeping work in 2018, which meant Bodine had known who we were, which meant, possibly, that Bodine knew who I was. I called Roberta from Owen's driveway in the dark. She listened and then said, "Joelle, save everything. Every email, every document. Don't delete anything, and don't move it from wherever it's currently stored. I'm going to reach out to Detective Caulfield's office in the morning." Caulfield, it turned out, had already been moving. He called me the following week. The threatening text had come from a prepaid phone. The serial numbers on a sample of the bills from the Lockbox had been run through a federal database, some traced to legitimate cash deposits. Others, and this was the part where I sat down on Owen's couch and stopped breathing normally for a few seconds, others cross-referenced with records from a 2019 federal investigation into structured cash transactions in Maricopa and Pinal counties, an investigation that had stalled because the central figure in their documentation had died before they could bring charges. The central figure was Douglas Heth. "And Terry Bodine?" I asked. "Mr. Bodine," Caulfield said carefully, "was identified as an associated party in the federal inquiry. The inquiry was deferred when Heth died. We are now in contact with the federal office that handled it." I thanked him and hung up and sat for a while in the gray Flagstaff afternoon looking at Owen's juniper trees in the yard. 3 days later, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered because Roberta had told me to answer everything and record it. The voice on the other end was smooth and measured, the voice of a man who had learned to control his affect in professional settings. "Mrs. Merritt," he said, "this is Terry Bodine. I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot." I said nothing. "That storage unit," he said, "contained assets from a business arrangement that Douglas and I built together over many years. Douglas was a complicated person, and he kept certain things without telling me the full picture, but I can assure you my interest in this situation is entirely about recovering what's rightfully part of his estate, and by extension, part of a legitimate business partnership." "Call my attorney," I said. "I understand you're being careful, and I respect that completely. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable. I'm asking for a conversation, just the two of us, before this becomes more complicated than it needs to." I hung up, forwarded the recording to Roberta and to Caulfield. That night, someone went through my car. I had left it parked on the street outside Owen's house. I hadn't planned on being there long enough to use his driveway. In the morning, the glove compartment was open, and my registration, proof of insurance, and a folder with some of my old business records were scattered on the passenger seat. Nothing had been taken, but they had my address. My Tucson address was on the registration. I called Roberta. I called Caulfield. I photographed everything. Then I drove to a diner at the edge of town and ordered eggs I didn't eat and thought about what Terry Bodine was looking for. The same answer came to me that it had come to Rachel in that other story, the type of story you recognize once you've lived it. He needed to know what documentation existed. Specifically, he needed to know whether Douglas Heth had kept records of the arrangement, because records cut both ways. They could establish Bodine's claim, or they could expose exactly what the arrangement had been. I didn't have those records, but I now understood that they might exist. I gave myself 2 days. I slept. I called my mother, didn't tell her anything specific, just let her talk to me about her garden and the neighbor's new dog and whether I was eating enough. I watched a movie on Owen's TV. I let my nervous system do something other than run on adrenaline. Then I went back to work. Roberta had pulled the complete filing history for Cobry Valley Management from the Arizona Corporation Commission. The LLC had been active from 2011 to 2020, when it had been voluntarily dissolved. 1 year before Heth's death, among the registered agent filings was a document address, a P.O. box in Casa Grande, and in the list of statutory agent updates filed over the years, there was a name I hadn't seen before, a woman named Sylvia Heth Drummond, Douglas Heth's sister. Heth had a sister, and she had been the registered statutory agent for Cobre Valley Management from 2016 until its dissolution. Roberta found her in 2 hours. Sylvia Heth Drummond, 63, lived in Coolidge, 20 minutes from Casa Grande. She had no criminal record. She had filed a modest estate claim on Douglas's death that had gone nowhere because his assets were tied up in the LLC dissolution. She had received nothing. I want to be careful here about what happened next, because I think this is the part of the story where some people would have done something reckless, and I understand the impulse. I did not contact Sylvia directly. I brought Sylvia's name to Detective Caulfield and to Roberta and let them work from there, because I had learned, at some cost over some years, that the impulse to do things yourself and do them fast is not always the same thing as wisdom. Caulfield interviewed Sylvia Drummond. What she told him, and what Roberta relayed to me afterward in careful summary, was this. Douglas Heth had asked Sylvia to serve as the statutory agent for Cobre Valley Management because she was, in his words, trustworthy and unlikely to attract attention. She had not known the specific nature of the business. What she had known, because Douglas told her in 2020, not long before the LLC was dissolved, was that there was a storage unit in Casa Grande with something valuable inside, and that if anything ever happened to him, she should find a way to claim it before anyone else did. She hadn't claimed it. She told Caulfield she had been afraid to, that she didn't know what was in it, and didn't want to know, that she had chosen to let it go into default and hoped it would simply disappear. She was describing, with some evident shame, the choice to not be involved, which was its own kind of choice. She had also, she told Caulfield, met Terry Bodine exactly once, in 2019, when he had come to her house unannounced and asked her whether Douglas had left any records, any documents, any notes about the business. She had told him she didn't know of any. He had thanked her and left. She described him as polite and frightening in equal measure. Roberta called me after she spoke to Caulfield. "Joelle," she said, "this is very good for us. Sylvia Drummond had an opportunity to claim the unit and chose not to, which strengthens your position as the legitimate purchaser. And her account of Bodine, approaching her independently of any legal process, is exactly the kind of corroborating behavior that builds a pattern." "What about the list?" I asked. "My name." Based on what Sylvia told Caulfield, our best working explanation is that Heth kept records of every individual or entity that had passed through the business in any capacity. Clients, vendors, bookkeepers. A kind of insurance. Your firm did bookkeeping work for one of Heth's properties for 8 months. That's most likely why you're on it. I sat with that for a while. Not comforting, exactly, but a shape I could understand. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday in February, about 3 months after I'd first pulled that panel off the false wall. By then, Roberta had filed an emergency motion to place the money under court-supervised escrow. Detective Caulfield had connected with the federal office that had originally investigated Heth, and a forensic accountant retained through the court had been working through the serial numbers for 6 weeks. The morning of the hearing, I put on a gray blazer I had ironed twice the night before because I needed to do something with my hands, and I drove to the Pinal County Courthouse in Florence and sat in a waiting room that smelled like floor cleaner and recycled air and told myself to breathe. Terry Bodine was there with his attorney, a man named Franklin Ames, from a Phoenix firm with a glass-fronted office on Camelback Road. Bodine was well-dressed and composed and looked at me across the waiting room with an expression of practiced neutrality. I looked back at him and then looked away, because I was not going to perform anything for him. The assistant county attorney handling the case was a woman named Daphne Kirsch. She was precise and methodical in a way I found deeply reassuring. She walked the judge through the timeline, the auction, the discovery, my report to the sheriff, the threatening text, Bodine's phone call, the car being searched, the forensic accountant's findings, some bills clean, some traceable to transactions flagged in the 2019 federal inquiry into structured cash activity. Then she introduced testimony from Sylvia Drummond, who had agreed to appear and whose account of Bodine approaching her privately, before any legal process had begun, sat in the room with a specific weight. Franklin Ames objected twice. The judge noted the objections and sustained neither. Then Daphne Kirsch said, "Your Honor, the state also wishes to note that we have received cooperation from the federal office that conducted the original inquiry into structured transactions connected to Cobray Valley Management. That cooperation has produced documentation indicating that Terry Bodine received 2 direct payments from Cobray Valley Management in 2016 and 2018, totaling approximately $140,000, and that at the time of those payments, Bodine's own attorneys had advised him in writing that the source of those funds required clarification before he could accept them." The room went quiet in a particular way. The kind of quiet where you can hear the ventilation system. Bodine turned to Ames and said something low. Ames put a hand briefly on Bodine's arm. The judge looked at the defense table. "Counsel, do you wish to respond at this time?" Ames stood. His voice was professionally steady. "Your Honor, my client maintains that any payments received from the LLC in question were consistent with a standard consulting arrangement, and he is prepared to provide documentation." "Mr. Ames," the judge said, "the question of what documentation your client can provide will be addressed in the subsequent proceeding. What I am noting at this time is that we have a pattern of extrajudicial contact with Ms. Merritt, with Ms. Drummond, that is difficult to reconcile with the position that Mr. Bodine has simply been attempting to pursue a legitimate legal claim through appropriate channels." She paused. "I am also directing that the County Bar's Ethics Board be notified regarding the conduct of Franklin Ames's firm in connection with the protective filing that was submitted last month, which sought to exclude the Cobray Valley corporate records on grounds this court finds unpersuasive." Ames sat down. Bodine was looking straight ahead. His composure was intact, but it had a different quality now, not control exactly, more like a man who has run out of moves and is waiting to see what happens next. The months after the hearing had the particular pace of legal processes. Slow, relentless, and exhausting in a specific way that is different from every other kind of exhaustion, because you can't hurry it and you can't ignore it. You just have to keep showing up. Franklin Ames withdrew from Bodine's case within 2 weeks of the hearing, citing a conflict. Bodine retained new counsel. His new attorney filed 2 motions in the first month, both denied. The federal office's involvement gave the state's case a weight that local maneuvering couldn't neutralize. The criminal case against Terry Bodine moved on 2 counts: witness intimidation, based on the threatening text and the corroborating evidence of the car search, and knowing receipt of proceeds from illegal structured transactions. The $140,000 in documented payments, especially given the contemporaneous written advice from his own attorneys, was harder to explain away than Bodine's new counsel had apparently anticipated. In May, Terry Bodine pleaded no contest to one count of receiving proceeds from illegal transactions. He received a fine of $175,000 and 2 years of supervised probation. He did not go to prison. I want to be honest that this part was hard to absorb. The disruption he had caused in my life, the fear, the searching of my car, the months of legal strain, felt larger than the consequence the court formally imposed. Roberta reminded me patiently that supervised probation for a commercial real estate developer is not a footnote. It's a public record. It affects financing, partnerships, licensing. It follows, and she was right. Within 6 months of the plea, 2 of Bodine Capital Group's pending commercial deals had been pulled by lenders citing the criminal record. A partner on a mixed-use project in Tempe had withdrawn. By the end of the year, the business was in a state of managed contraction that people in that industry recognize as the beginning of the end. The civil determination came in June. The forensic accountant's final report had traced approximately $190,000 of the $612,000 to transactions flagged as structurally irregular by the federal inquiry, close enough to demonstrable criminal proceeds that the court found for civil forfeiture on that portion. The remaining $422,000, which could not be connected to traceable illegal sources and for which no valid claimant had standing, was determined to belong to me as the lawful purchaser of the unit and its contents. $422,000. I sat in Roberta's parking lot for a long time after she called me with the final number. It was June in Arizona, which means the heat is physical, the kind that presses on you. I had the air conditioning running, and I watched a family of quail cross the parking lot in a wobbling line, the way quail do, and I thought about the past 8 months. The copy center, my kitchen table covered in cash, Owen's juniper trees, the courthouse in Florence, the way Bodine's composure had changed in that hearing room, not breaking but going still in a particular way, like a machine that has stopped receiving power. I called Owen first. He cried, which surprised me, and then didn't surprise me because Owen had been worried for months in that quiet way of his that didn't ask questions but showed up. I called my mother and told her everything. She was quiet for a long time and then said, "I always knew you were going to figure it out." She says this about most things, in retrospect, but I didn't mind. Roberta sent me a card with a simple note. "You navigated this better than most would have. Well done." I put it on my refrigerator. With the settlement money, I did what I had been wanting to do since the year Dennis Farrow handed me a non-compete clause and took my business. I restarted. I registered a new LLC under my own name alone, Merit Accounting Services, and I spent 3 months building it quietly, carefully, without partners, without anyone's name on it but mine. I took on 2 clients in the first month. By the end of the year, I had 7. The reputation I'd lost when Dennis walked away with our client list didn't come back. I built a different one. I also helped my brother put a new roof on his house in Flagstaff, which had been leaking for 2 winters. He protested until I told him it wasn't a gift. It was rent for all the couch time. He stopped protesting. Dennis Farrow, for what it's worth, was doing adequately. Not badly, not well, just adequately. The way people sometimes do when they've taken something that wasn't entirely theirs and are making only average use of it. I don't wish him harm. I also don't wish him anything in particular. He takes up a small, sealed room in my memory, and mostly I don't go near it. Terry Bodine sold his house in Scottsdale by the following spring. Where he went, I don't know. His name still comes up occasionally in connection with the broader federal inquiry, which expanded in scope as the cooperation agreements produced more documentation. He was a secondary figure, it turned out, not the architect of anything. Just someone who had accepted money he'd been told not to accept and had spent years hoping that would never become relevant. Sylvia Drummond sent me a letter, handwritten, about a month after the civil determination. She apologized for not claiming the unit, which she said she knew didn't make sense, and she thanked me for handling things in a way that hadn't made her life harder. She sounded like someone who had been waiting a long time to put something down. I wrote back. We've exchanged a few letters since. She has a garden in Coolidge that she describes in more detail than seems strictly necessary, and I find that I don't mind. The list of 11 names, my name among them, turned out, as Roberta had suspected, to be exactly what it looked like. A record Heth had kept of every person or entity that had touched his business over the years, for reasons that probably seemed practical to him at the time. Insurance, or leverage, or just the particular anxiety of a man who knew what he was doing and knew what it meant if it came to light. 7 of the names were identifiable businesses or individuals with legitimate prior dealings. 3 were entities that the federal inquiry was still untangling when I stopped tracking it closely. And 1, the name just above mine on the list, a man named Patrick Sue, had apparently been a CPA in the Casa Grande area who had done similar work to what I had done years before I had, and who had left the state in 2017 without forwarding information. Whether he knew what he'd been involved with, I have no way of knowing. My name was on a list in a dead man's storage unit because I had done 8 months of bookkeeping work for a property management company without knowing what was behind it. That's the complete explanation, and it's also a thing I have sat with at some length, because there is a version of my life where I had known, where someone had told me, or where I had looked more closely, or where the right information had crossed my desk, and I had either walked away from the money or not. I don't know which. I hope I would have walked away. I think I would have. But I didn't have to make that choice because I didn't know, and the difference between not making a choice and making the right one is one of those things I think about on quiet evenings and don't fully resolve. The storage facility at Desert West is still there on that highway south of Tucson. Earl Briggs is still the manager, as far as I know. I drove past it once, a few months after everything was settled, just to look at it from the road. It's a long, low building with a chain-link fence and the particular quality of stillness that storage facilities have, all that accumulated life boxed up and waiting. Unit 118 had been re-auctioned by then. Someone else's $75, someone else's Saturday. I kept the lockbox, not for any sentimental reason. It's too banged up from the angle grinder to be useful. But I have it on a shelf in my office as a reminder of something I think about when the work is hard or the business is slow or I wake up at 2 a.m., convinced that I've made some irreversible mistake. What I found inside it changed my life. But the thing that actually mattered was what I did next. Not reckless, not paralyzed, just methodical and stubborn and precise, one documented step at a time. That's the whole of it, really. There's no secret to it, and there's no luck in it. Just a list of names, and one of them was mine, and I decided to find out what that meant rather than run from it. So tell me, what would you have done? Your name on a stranger's list, a box full of cash, a text telling you to walk away. Would you have put it back? Would you have kept quiet and hoped? Comment below and let me know. I read everything, and if this story stayed with you, I'd love for you to subscribe. Thank you for being here.